A lot of powerful players in aviation want Embraer to build an aircraft to rival the Boeing 737 and Airbus A320 families, and there are actually some good reasons why Embraer really is the right company to do that, and also to do it right now. But will they? Would launching such an aircraft actually make sense from Embraer's own point of view? And if they can't do it on their own, who would potentially help them? Stay tuned. I recently made a video about Airbus where I talked about how their plans to launch a new aircraft might change due to some interesting new developments. Basically, they have now agreed that they won't be able to create a new hydrogen-powered aircraft until much later than they first thought. In fact, it will likely take more than a decade longer until all related technologies are in place, and that, we argued, could mean that Airbus might now have to move with plans to launch a more conventional airliner before that to replace the Airbus A320 family. If they would go ahead with that though, they would need to do it relatively quickly, because they would need to give this new aircraft time to get a proper foothold in the market before any alternative propulsion technologies render it obsolete. You see, aircraft manufacturers really need to think in decades when they evaluate new projects like this, not just quarters and years. Or at least that's what we argued in that previous video that we made. But we have since had some feedback from that theory, both from viewers like you and also from industry insiders that have, well, let's say, poked a few holes in our original theory. For one thing, there seems to be a question of timing. It's pretty clear that Boeing will take years, probably a decade, before they are fully back on their feet again and realistically ready to create anything new in this space. And if that's the case, that would take the pressure off Airbus, who could therefore just sit back and rake home the money that they have from their existing backlog. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that Airbus would wait that long to create something new. They still have engineers who need work in order to stay sharp, but that's kind of a different point. Even more importantly though, there is another, less obvious factor in play here. About a year ago, just as Boeing was undergoing management changes following the MAX door plug blowout scandal, Dave Calhoun, the then outgoing CEO of Boeing, made a statement that seemed on the surface just plain weird. He said that the next Boeing CEO would need to decide whether or not to launch a new airliner program, and he then added that this new airplane, whether it came or not, would likely cost Boeing $50 billion. On the face of it, this was a ridiculously high number. It just didn't make any real sense. As Liam News explains, an all-new single-aisle aircraft would be expected to cost between $10 and $12 billion to develop, before factoring in things like delays and cost overruns. Now, wide bodies can run between $15 and $20 billion to develop, but none of those numbers are absolute. Bombardier, for example, needed between $6 and $7 billion to develop the C-Series, which is now known as the Airbus A220. Again, this is all without cost overruns, who can build up quite fast. As an example, Airbus needed an estimated $25 billion to develop the Airbus A380, which was up from an initial estimate of around $11 billion or so. And Boeing's 787 was even worse than that. Its initial budget was just $7 billion, under the assumption that its suppliers would pay for the rest, but those costs then quickly more than doubled as the plane's development slowed down. And then, with so many problems hitting the aircraft later in service, the total cost of the program is now estimated to be around $50 billion. Again, that's up from an estimate of $7. But the 787 is a very special case. Even 10 years ago, well before the production stoppages and other recent issues of the 787, it was clear that Boeing would never make an overall profit on that aircraft. And no manufacturer would plan to produce an aircraft with such a catastrophic development economy again, so it is unlikely that this was what Calhoun came up with and was referring to with his $50 billion price tag. No, instead, the real reason why the cost of a new Boeing 737 MAX replacement, and actually also an Airbus A320neo replacement, could get this high has to do with the sales that the manufacturers will lose for their existing aircraft lineups. The actual cost of developing a new Boeing or Airbus single-aisle jet today, factoring in some delays and overruns, would probably be around $20 billion or so, which is already higher than it should be due to various organizational issues within these colossal companies. But the rest of the cost will come from not only the loss of new sales of 737s and A320neos, it will also include the cancellations of existing aircraft orders, which could run into many hundreds. Now, I did mention this briefly in my previous video, arguing that, for example, Airbus backlog is so enormous right now that flipping over some existing sales to the newer plane wouldn't be so bad. If anything, some of the customers in the back of the queue who weren't expecting the new planes before the mid-2030s anyway would benefit from this, getting their planes a bit faster, so everyone should be happy, right? Well, it turns out that it's just not that simple. For one thing, an Airbus customer who is now in the back of the Airbus A320 production queue would probably not agree to get their plane a few years faster if by then the plane would still be the old model. If an airline isn't in a hurry to get its jets quickly anyway and have adjusted their fleet plans accordingly and would then learn of plans for a new Boeing or Airbus, why would they not just stick to their long-term plan then and wait for that newer model instead? So in short, if Boeing launched a 737 replacement, they would need to deal with this $50 billion total cost. And like I mentioned before, they are still in full recovery mode, which means that they simply can't afford it. Airbus, on the other hand, probably can afford it, but they have no motivation to even try. In fact, the only reason Airbus would consider making something new would therefore be if someone else went for it first. And that finally is where Embraer enters this picture. Because unlike Airbus or Boeing, Embraer actually doesn't have anything to lose. For them, developing a nice, modern and efficient single aisle with around 180 seats plus a couple of bigger and smaller variants of it would probably cost around $5 to $10 billion to do. That's less than what Airbus or Boeing would need because Embraer are a smaller, leaner company, although there is a small caveat to that which I'll get back to soon. But the main point is that Embraer wouldn't risk losing any existing sales by launching a new heart-of-the-market airliner to compete with the 737 and Airbus A320neo, and that's because, obviously, their largest existing aircraft, the E195-E2, is quite a bit smaller. So a new, bigger aircraft wouldn't compete with their current lineup, instead it would complement it perfectly, essentially bringing a new revenue stream for the company. Now, Embraer absolutely does have the engineering capacity to pull this off. As I explained before, they have already developed aircraft of this size, the KC-390 military cargo aircraft, and they did that whilst also developing the commercial E2 series at the same time. On top of that, a recent airline survey confirms something that we have known for a while now. The industry really wants Embraer to step up here. The airlines and lessors desperately want a third player to take on Boeing and Airbus, and they think Embraer could be the one to pull this off. So if Embraer have the people for this, which they do, if they have the customers, which they seem to do, and they have such a cost advantage over the two duopoly aircraft makers, well then, what are they waiting for? Well, I'll get back to that in just a moment, but before I do, have you noticed an uptick in annoying spam emails, messages and robocalls lately? If you have, it's likely that your personal information is being bought and sold without your knowledge or consent by loads of different companies out there, known as data brokers. These companies make a living from harvesting and selling personal data, and it gets much scarier than just your email. It might also include your phone numbers, home address, and even your social security number and info about your family and friends. My lead editor, Dominic, found this out the hard way, but he has now been using today's sponsor, Delete Me, for a few months, and it has really helped. Delete Me works by finding these data brokers and then command them to delete your data from their services one by one. They will basically do all of the hard work for you and then present the results in neat, regular reports. And believe Dom when he says that those reports will show you much longer lists than you might expect. So if you want to start scrubbing the internet clean from your digital information, just use your phone and scan this QR code or go to joindeleteme.com/mentor now and use the code MENTORNOW. If you're based in the US, you will then get an extra 20% off your plan, and you're also supporting our work. A big thanks to Delete Me for sponsoring this video. Now, let's get back to Embraer and their plans. So, what's stopping Embraer from launching something to compete with Boeing and Airbus in the lucrative single-aisle market here? Well, the most obvious thing is, as always, money. Now, financially, Embraer has actually been doing reasonably well in the last few years. In 2024, they hit $6.4 billion of annual revenue, which is a 21% increase from the year before. And they have an order backlog of $26.3 billion, representing a 40% growth. That is a very impressive recovery given how bad things were for the company even before the pandemic, but even so, Embraer today just aren't big enough to take on a new project that would cost $10 billion to develop, at least not on their own. As I've said in the past, Embraer don't want to share the fate of Bombardier in Canada, who launched the C-Series, a promising but ambitious and expensive project that they then couldn't afford, and ultimately had to give it up along with the rest of their commercial aircraft division. Embraer obviously are keenly aware of this, and they have been looking for project partners for some time now. Even before the prospect of making a mid-sized single-aisle jet, they were thinking about launching a new turboprop aircraft, which would have also required some sort of partnership to pull it off. That's why they have recently been re-exploring their options with prospective partners around the world, ranging from Saab in Sweden to partners in Poland, Japan, and even China. Now, some of these partnerships mainly involve other Embraer aircraft, like their KC-390 military cargo jet, but Embraer could conceivably also look for partners that can contribute to more than one project. On the other hand, Embraer have also learned in a quite painful way that they need to be quite wary of any partnerships, and I'm not just referring to the relatively recent Boeing adventures here. No, way before that, back in the late 1980s, Embraer had already made a name for themselves in the airliner world thanks to their EMB 120 Brasilia twin turboprop. And they quickly decided to embark on a more advanced project, the CBA 123 Vector. This ended up being a joint project with FAMA, an Argentinian company, and the aircraft had some really unique features. It was also going to be a turboprop, but its two engines were mounted on the tail in a pusher configuration which would reduce its noise. This plane was quite technologically advanced for its time and actually looked quite similar in overall configuration to Boeing's plans for an open-fan 7J7, which was also being discussed at roughly that same time. Embraer and FAMA went quite far into this project, building two prototypes, the first of which flew in 1990, but unfortunately, the timing of that project just wasn't in their favor. The high development cost of the CBA 123 meant that it would have been significantly more expensive than other turboprops of that same era. And even worse here, the higher oil prices that had favored smaller turboprops early in the 1980s had now started to go in the other direction, favoring smaller jets instead. So eventually that project had to be cancelled when the partners couldn't continue funding its development. Embraer had to fire thousands of their workers and also got reorganized and privatized as a result. The only real silver lining was that some of the work that had been done could be repurposed for the ERJ-135 and 145 jets, which were being developed in parallel. Now, that story was Embraer's first major existential crisis, and even though Embraer's partner wasn't really the cause of the project's failure, handling a lack of funds whilst also having to depend on an industrial partner very likely made matters much worse here. Embraer's second crisis involving a partner was, of course, the time that they sought to join forces with Boeing. But on that occasion, even though the deal was called a joint venture, it really was a takeover. Under that agreement, Embraer would basically sell 80% of their commercial aircraft division to Boeing, and that part of the business would then be renamed Boeing Brazil. It would still be run from Brazil, but it would belong to Boeing in the United States. So if that would have gone forward, Boeing wouldn't have just acquired the E and E2 series of aircraft, they would have also owned any new airliners that would be developed and produced. Now, Brazil's people are understandably proud of their country's aviation sector, which Embraer is a key part of, so that joint venture would have been quite a tough sell for the country as a whole. The Embraer name would have continued to exist in this case, but only for the company's other aircraft, the business jets, the crop dusting planes, as well as their military trainers, cargo aircraft and other defense projects. But the rest would have effectively become Boeing's instead. Now, there was also a second Embraer-Boeing joint venture involving specifically the KC-390 military cargo plane, but this venture didn't involve a sale of Embraer's military division. Embraer would retain 51% ownership of the KC-390, and Boeing would help promote and support it internationally. Now, there's a lot more to say about this story, including the fact that it went through as a reaction to Bombardier's sale of the C-Series to Airbus, but the part that became a painful lesson for Embraer is how it ended up falling apart. Initially, the two joint ventures were expected to get the green light from the Boeing and Embraer boards and from international regulators in 2019, but that didn't happen. And in 2020, Boeing announced that they were terminating the agreement because of Embraer's failure to meet certain required closing conditions. Embraer was furious, making it clear that in their view, Boeing backtracked because of their financial problems after the MAX crashes and the pandemic. Embraer also sued Boeing, and the courts eventually ended up siding with them, directing Boeing to pay Embraer $150 million as compensation. But that amount was actually quite low. Many analysts believe that Embraer should have been awarded over double that, between $300 and $400 million. You see, the key point here was that Embraer was expected to make a lot of organizational changes in order for this deal to go through. And for one thing, they would need to separate their commercial aircraft division from the rest of the company, which was neither easy nor cheap. And on top of that, sales of the E-175 in the US and the newer E-2 jets around the world slowed down dramatically in 2018 and 2019 as a direct result of the expected deal. This was because it made perfect sense for airlines and lessors who were already Boeing customers to wait, because they could then negotiate an E2 deal, for example in combination with other Boeing orders, in order to get a better price. The E190-E2 and the E195-E2 got certified in 2018 and 2019 respectively, so the news of a Boeing deal and the order slowdown that then followed hit Embraer at the worst possible time. And it then took years for the sales of these jets to recover. Sales of the military KC-390 were similarly anemic in that period, but are recovering nicely now. And all of this shows just how costly this affair ended up being for Embraer. So I guess the point that I'm trying to make here is that after these adventures, first with the CBA-123 and then with Boeing, Embraer is very cautious about what kind of partnerships that they get into. If they are going to embark on any new kind of partnership or joint venture, it's likely that that would need to be done in such a way that they, Embraer, retains full control of it. And that is going to be difficult. There are aviation giants out there like Lockheed Martin, Mitsubishi and maybe even Comac in China that would have the funds and maybe the motivation to invest in such a project. But given the costs involved, would they do so without having a controlling stake? Skeptic. And if they don't, who would be willing to fund such an Embraer project on more favorable terms? Well, perhaps the most likely candidate here is Saudi Arabia and its Sovereign Wealth Fund. That's the country's public investment fund, which is currently valued at $925 billion. That's billions with a B. Not only could the Saudis easily afford this, they are also more likely to be comfortable with the complexities involved, including time. Their fund actually specializes in long-term projects, and few projects are longer term than producing modern airliners. An aircraft's concept could take a few years to finalize and 6 to 7 years to develop after launch. And even after it's certified and in service, it could then take another 6 to 8 years, or even more than that, to break even. So a partner with both deep pockets and long patience and investment horizon is an absolute must here. And in terms of geopolitics, Saudi Arabia has been under some scrutiny over the past few years, but if Embraer are to continue selling to customers in the same markets that they do today, well then the Saudi investment fund would likely be more acceptable politically than, for example, China would. Separately, the Saudis have shown a lot of interest in aviation lately. They recently launched a new airline, Riyadh Air, to take on the rest of the airlines in the Gulf region, and the country's investment fund is that airline's backer. Now, I said earlier that Embraer can develop an aircraft cheaper than Airbus or Boeing can, and that's mainly because with a leaner organization they can take decisions quicker and push development faster. But that can also backfire. Aircraft makers have to make sure that they design aircraft that will be profitable to manufacture once their deals and contracts with suppliers are in place. And developing an aircraft quickly as a small manufacturer with relatively limited negotiating power can lead to planes that are expensive to produce. And that's something that caught Bombardier out when they developed their C-series. That's why it's important to have a solid deal with a backer that understands the risks and the timelines that we have in the aviation world. And even then, Embraer would have to rely on most of the same suppliers that Boeing and Airbus does, and that would also mean facing the same potential shortages of parts. Finally, as I said in the very beginning, the airline industry thinks in decades, not months and years. And even if Embraer moves first with a new airliner in this case to rival the 737 and the Airbus A320neo, someone else, likely Airbus, could then follow and still get more sales. This has happened before. In the 1970s, the Airbus A300 became the world's first wide-body twin jet at a time when fuel efficiency quickly became the dominant factor in commercial aviation. And nobody then had an answer for the A300 for several years. But when Boeing finally prepared their answer, the 767, they managed to outsell the A300 quite easily. So the aviation world isn't a race where the first to the finish line is always the winner. But then, on the other hand, even if the A300 didn't dominate, it was certainly successful enough to cement Airbus as an aircraft manufacturer that should be taken seriously. And that, I think, is a realistic long-term target for Embraer here. To become a fully grounded and reliable manufacturer of mainline airliners, and hopefully then turn our current duopoly into a triopoly. We are all aviation fans here, and we all want to see progress in the world of aviation, but figuring out if taking on the big players makes sense from a newcomer's perspective, well, it turns out that's easier said than done. What do you think? What should Embraer do here? Should they launch a new, bigger single-aisle airliner or play it safe in their own market? Let me know in the comments here below. Now, I hope that you've noticed that my friend Ben has started helping me to present some of these videos as we aim to create even more quality content for you. It just wouldn't be possible for me to expand my team this way if it wasn't for the support we are receiving from our fantastic Patreons. And if you want to contribute as well, then scan this QR code or go to patreon.com/join/mentorpilot. I would love to see you in my next Zoom hangout. Thank you so much for watching, and also remember to check out the description or the pinned comment in this video for your special deal from today's sponsor. That also really helps us. My name is Peter Hörnfeldt and you're watching Mentour now. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.